Vermont Senator and 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders gave a speech in Washington today to pitch the country on his political philosophy of democratic socialism. Sanders by no means invented the term democratic socialism, but he very well may have led to its rebirth in the United States. Before Sanders' unsuccessful 2016 presidential bid, membership in the Democratic Socialists of America was just 5,000 people. But since Sanders' campaign ended and President Trump was elected, membership in the DSA has shot up to roughly 60,000. Hear for yourself how Sanders pitched democratic socialism earlier today.
The United States and the rest of the world face two very different political paths. On one hand, there is a growing movement toward oligarchy and authoritarianism, in which a small number of incredibly wealthy and powerful billionaires own and control a significant part of the economy and exert enormous influence over the political life. Right now, in the United States of America, 3 families control more wealth than the bottom half of our country, some 160 million Americans. The top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 92%. Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped create a government that made transformative progress in protecting the needs of working families. Today, in the second decade of the 21st century, we must take up the unfinished business of the New Deal and carry it to completion. We must recognize that in the 21st century, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, economic rights are human rights. And that is what I mean by democratic socialism.
CBSN political contributor Sean Sullivan joins me now. Sean is a reporter covering national politics for The Washington Post. And fresh off his trip to Iowa is CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Like, really fresh, Ed, right? You just came from the airport. Oh, we don't have your mic. Yes. Hang on. Say that again, Ed.
I said literally, folks, not a joke, as Joe Biden would say.
Okay, great. All right, Sean, while Ed catches his breath, since he just ran in from the airport, let me ask you about this speech, focusing a lot on FDR and the New Deal. So what vision of socialism did Sanders actually put forward here with this speech?
Well, it's important to look at the context of this speech, first off, which is that Bernie Sanders, is, number one, the only candidate in the Democratic field who is not a Democrat. He is a political independent. He identifies as a democratic socialist. And so this has been a source of tension, not just with Republicans, but with other Democrats. You've seen other Democrats run against socialism. You've seen President Trump and his allies run against socialism and try to cast the entire Democratic Party as socialist by tying them to Bernie Sanders. And today, what we heard from Bernie Sanders was sort of an effort to set the record straight. He did invoke FDR a lot. He did talk about the historical line of history and sort of drew a line between the current situation in the world right now and some of the upheaval we saw in the 20th century. And his message was basically, look, my ideas are not so radical. They have actually been pursued in sort of different ways by other historical figures, including FDR. And if we embrace these ideas, this is the best way to defeat Donald Trump. So that's his argument. The question now is, how does that get received by Democrats, a lot of whom are still skeptical and uneasy with the idea of a socialist being their standard bearer?
Ed, do we have a sense, why did Sanders give this speech now?
Yeah, I asked some Sanders campaign aides that question earlier today. And first of all, they said, remember, he actually gave a similar version of this about 4 years ago, a little more than 4 years ago, where he was trying to, at that time, explain and defend what was then sort of more an emerging train of thought among Democrats, which now has become far more mainstream. They felt the need today to sort of remind Democrats that a lot of the founding principles of the party are rooted in elements of what he describes as democratic socialism. And the fact that he was going back to FDR and reminding people that a lot of what was started during that era, Social Security and the general social safety net, are sort of bedrock principles of Democrats then, now, and should continue to be, and that, as FDR said in one of his final addresses, that there was unfinished business that has yet to be completed regarding economic rights and human rights. But he also gives this address, think about this, about 2 weeks before the first debate, at a time when he seems to have stalled at second place in statewide surveys and national surveys. And at a time, too, when, frankly, Republicans are spending almost every major address, floor speech, cable television news appearance, or presidential fundraising address given, calling out socialism and the fact that Democrats are beginning to embrace socialist ideas and the views of Republicans, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and other things. They're misconstruing the details a bit, but there is concern among many Democrats, especially some of the moderates running for president, that talk about the potential dangers of socialism could spoil the party's chances of holding on to its congressional majority and possibly lose the White House.
So with that in mind, there's a clip I'd like to play. It's Senator Sanders going after President Trump.
If you are the Trump family, you got $885 million worth of tax breaks and subsidies for your family's housing empire that was built on racial discrimination. When Trump screams socialism, all of his hypocrisy will not be lost on the American people. Americans will know that he is attacking all that we take for granted, from Social Security to Medicare to veterans' health care to roads and bridges to public schools to national parks to clean water and clean air. When Trump attacks socialism, I am reminded again of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor," end quote. And that is the difference between Donald Trump and me. He believes in corporate socialism for the rich and powerful. I believe in a democratic socialism that works for the working families of this country.
So, Sean, on the surface, Senator Sanders clearly went after President Trump in this speech. But to what extent was this speech a critique of the Democratic field?
Well, it's interesting when you listen to what he's saying about President Trump, you can understand why he's making that argument. Right now, for a lot of Democratic voters, the main question on their mind, and I heard this from a lot of voters when I was in Iowa over the weekend, is which of these candidates can defeat President Trump? Which of these candidates is best positioned to take him on one-on-one? And so it's not surprising to hear Senator Sanders offer that argument, because a lot of voters are also looking at the situation and saying, well, hold on a second, what about the idea of a socialist, democratic socialist even taking on Trump? Could that be a liability for the Democratic Party? And so Senator Sanders is saying, look, here's why I think I could take on Trump. Again, that is how effective that argument is. We'll find out in the coming weeks. Now, when it comes to how he compares with other Democrats, this speech could indeed have another function, which is further separating him and distinguishing him from some of the other Democrats. He didn't mention any of them by name and didn't even really seem to make a strong implicit contrast. But it's important to note the timing of this speech. We're in this situation now where you see Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, gaining in the polls, gaining ground on Sanders, and she is now in a pretty fierce competition with him for liberal voters, for progressive voters on the leftward edge of the Democratic Party. And so this is a way for Senator Sanders to distinguish himself from Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is an avowed capitalist. She's made that clear over and over again. Sanders is a democratic socialist. And so with this speech, intentional or not, we see that line that distinguishes them, Warren on one side, Sanders on the other, become a little bit darker coming out of this.
Meantime, Ed, today is the cutoff for candidates to qualify for the first Democratic debates. What are you hearing from campaigns about the debate criteria?
that they are, if they're on the bubble, they're hoping and praying that somebody releases a poll any minute now that perhaps improves their chances, and they will be tallying every single penny up until midnight tonight before submitting their final reports to the DNC. They are due to party officials by 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. Act Blue, which is the big online fundraising tool used by Democratic campaigns all across the country up and down the ballot, is set to certify the process for the DNC and submit a report to them by early afternoon. And then by some point, hopefully by about this time tomorrow, we will know exactly who will be on stage at those two first debates in Miami later this month. We don't know on which night each will appear, nor do we know exactly how that is being determined. That's in the hands of NBC, which is hosting the first two debates. But we will know exactly who is playing on either of those two nights by the end of tomorrow. The other thing to keep in mind, there are, in a bid to make sure that the top tier and the lower tier don't necessarily all end up on different nights, there are methods in place to ensure that you see some combination of maybe Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris on one night, plus Jay Inslee or Julian Castro or somebody else who's sort of lower down the scale, and that they're trying to come up with a healthy mix. As we've seen Joe Biden suggest just in the last day or so, more than anything, this is sort of a brief get-to-know-you introduction forum. This is not necessarily a debate. Interesting to see the frontrunner already lowering expectations for what this forum could produce, and he has a point. With 20 people trying to cut through on a crowded stage that will include at one time or another at least 3 moderators, it's going to be pretty crowded. And if you're not somebody like Joe Biden, who is well known to TV viewers, you're going to have a really incredible standout viral moment. And that's going to be pretty hard given the format.
Yeah, I mean, the logistics just sound challenging at the very least. So
I would hate to be the guy who has to string all the audio of 10 candidates and 3 moderators together.
Absolutely. It'll be really fascinating to see how that first one especially goes. But Ed, there are also reports that Howard Schultz is scaling back his campaign, but could reportedly re-enter the race after Super Tuesday if Joe Biden is not the presumptive nominee. What does this mean for the rest of the field?
Yeah, and I actually, some reporting I picked up on suggested he may just reactivate as early as this fall. First off, he is recovering from 3 back surgeries that had to occur after a visit earlier this year to Arizona when he was on this sort of exploratory tour. He admitted to supporters today in an email that those 3 back surgeries have sidelined him, and he's had to scale back his plans to travel and continue exploring a possible presidential run. I've also been in touch with some folks who concede that, yes, he has scaled back his staffing a bit, in part because he simply can't be as politically active as he wanted to be. Some reports suggest that he might flip a switch next year in early March if Joe Biden doesn't emerge from Super Tuesday as the frontrunner. I got some guidance from at least one source this afternoon who said it could be that they keep an eye on the first few debates, and if there's some sense that Biden is slipping or that the conversation is veering too far into Bernie Sanders territory, frankly, then perhaps he would try to revive his ambitions at some point this fall. But clearly he has a medical issue. And beyond that, though, it still wasn't entirely clear to us, and I think Sean would agree, that where exactly he would fit into this debate, given that there's a pretty robust one going on among Democrats and the president already, and still untested theory that a third option somewhere down the middle could somehow prevail.
Sean, we only have about a minute left, but I do want to ask about some of your reporting from Iowa this week about how the underdogs in this race are looking to sell themselves as the so-called Joe Biden alternative. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I was across the state at several different events over the weekend, and what I heard from a lot of candidates was an attempt to distinguish themselves from Joe Biden, or at least implicitly do so when it comes to policies, when it comes to the generational contrast. We heard this from Bernie Sanders. We heard this from Elizabeth Warren. We also heard some of it from Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg. And so there's clearly a sort of effort and a sort of race within the larger primary to be that Biden alternative in Iowa. And why is that important? Well, Iowa has a history of rewarding underdog candidates who are willing to put in the face time with caucus goers on a one-on-one basis over and over, to the point that you could have an upset. You know, we look at the last two contested Democratic caucuses. Bernie Sanders came very, very close to defeating Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Iowa. And then, of course, in 2008, Barack Obama did win Iowa. He defeated Hillary Clinton that year. Neither of those candidates were favored going into the caucus year. So Iowa is a place where if Joe Biden is not careful, one of these underdog candidates could catch him and perhaps ultimately defeat him there.
All right, Sean Sullivan and Ed O'Keefe racing back to keep his commitment to us on Red and Blue here. We appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you.